Marcus Chen had always prided himself on being adaptable. Growing up in Detroit's roughest neighborhoods had taught him to read situations quickly and adjust accordingly. But nothing in his 28 years of life had prepared him for Kepler-7, a frontier colony world where humans lived alongside genetically enhanced beings known as variants. The planet's twin suns cast everything in perpetual amber light, and the air carried scents of alien spices that made his nose tingle constantly. He'd arrived 3 months ago as part of the Colonial Development Initiative, tasked with establishing trade relationships between human settlements and variant communities. The pay was excellent, the work challenging, and the opportunity to be part of humanity's expansion into the stars had seemed like a dream come true. What the recruitment videos hadn't mentioned was the complex social hierarchy that governed interactions between species, or how easily a misunderstood gesture could turn deadly. The Meridian Bazaar sprawled across several city blocks in New Harmony, the planet's largest mixed settlement. Vendors of every conceivable species hawked their wares from colorful stalls that seemed to defy architectural logic. Floating platforms sold crystalline sculptures that sang in the wind, while ground-level booths offered everything from exotic foods to advanced technology. The cacophony of voices, music, and machinery created a symphony of commerce that never seemed to pause. Marcus had quickly learned to navigate the bazaar's unwritten rules. Never make direct eye contact with a crystalline unless they address you first. Always bow slightly when passing a mentalist stall. Keep your hands visible when dealing with the paranoid shadowkin traders. But it was the Beastwomen who commanded the most respect and fear. These weren't the gentle, cat-like beings depicted in human entertainment media. Beastwomen were apex predators who'd volunteered for genetic enhancement centuries ago, trading their humanity for incredible strength, speed, and sensory abilities. They stood 7 feet tall on average, with muscular frames that could bend steel and reflexes that made them blur when they moved. Their faces retained human-like features, but were marked by prominent canine teeth, enhanced bone structure, and eyes that seemed to see through souls. Victoria Blackthorn was the most notorious Beastwoman in New Harmony. She controlled the eastern quarter of the bazaar through a combination of legitimate business ownership and barely concealed intimidation. Her security company, Apex Protection Services, had contracts with most of the major vendors, and her people patrolled the market with the confidence of those who knew they were untouchable. Marcus first encountered her during his second week on Kepler-7. He'd been examining some local textiles at Elena Rodriguez's stall when Victoria approached. Even without looking up, he'd felt her presence like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. The conversations around them had gradually died as other shoppers noticed her and found reasons to be elsewhere. "You're the new human trade liaison," she'd said, her voice carrying the slight growl that marked all Beastwomen's speech. I've heard about you." When Marcus finally looked up, he'd been struck by how her appearance managed to be both beautiful and terrifying. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical braid, revealing the strong lines of her jaw and neck. Her eyes were amber with flecks of gold, and they seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance and find him wanting. "Marcus Thompson," he'd replied, extending his hand in what he hoped was a confident gesture. "I'm here to help facilitate better trade relationships between all the communities." She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment before deliberately ignoring it. "See that you remember whose territory you're operating in," she'd said, then walked away without another word. Since then, their interactions had been limited but consistently tense. Victoria seemed to take his very presence as a personal affront, and Marcus had learned to avoid the sections of the bazaar where her influence was strongest. He tried to understand what he'd done wrong, but his inquiries among other traders had yielded only nervous deflections and advice to stay out of her way. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Marcus had arrived at the bazaar early, hopping to catch the breakfast crowd and introduce himself to some new vendors. The air was particularly fragrant that day, carrying scents of roasted grains and exotic fruits from the food court. He'd made good progress, successfully negotiating preliminary agreements with 3 different traders when he spotted a familiar face. Thomas Kim ran a small electronics stall near the bazaar's center. He specialized in communication devices and navigation equipment, serving customers who ranged from local residents to deep space traders. Marcus had been trying to establish a relationship with him for weeks, knowing that reliable communication equipment would be crucial for expanding trade routes to more remote human settlements. Thomas was struggling with a heavy crate of merchandise, trying to maneuver it onto his display counter while maintaining his balance on the bazaar's uneven flooring. Without thinking, Marcus jogged over to help. "Here, let me get that for you," he said, grabbing one end of the crate. Together, they managed to lift it into position without dropping any of the delicate equipment inside. "Thanks, Marcus," Thomas said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I've been telling myself I need to hire some help, but business has been slow lately." "Maybe we can change that," Marcus replied with a genuine smile. "I've got some human settlements that are desperate for reliable communication equipment. If your prices are competitive, I think we could work out something beneficial for everyone." Thomas's face lit up with excitement. "Really? That would be incredible. Business has been tough since Victoria started requiring everyone to use her preferred suppliers for security-related equipment." A security-related. Communication devices, surveillance equipment, anything that could theoretically be used for intelligence gathering. She says it's for everyone's protection, but her approved suppliers charge twice what independent vendors like me can offer. Marcus frowned. This was the first he'd heard of such restrictions, and they definitely violated the free trade agreements that were supposed to govern the bazaar. That doesn't sound legal. Legal and practical are different things out here, Thomas said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. Victoria's got the colonial authorities' ear, and they generally let her handle security matters however she sees fit. Before Marcus could respond, he felt that familiar weight pressing down on him. The conversations around them began to fade as other people noticed what was happening and decided they had urgent business elsewhere. Marcus turned slowly, already knowing what he would see. Victoria Blackthorne stood about 20 feet away, her amber eyes locked on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. She was wearing her usual outfit, dark leather pants and a fitted jacket that somehow managed to look both professional and menacing. Her hands hung loose at her sides, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders that suggested she was ready to spring into action at any moment. "Thompson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet section of Bazaar. "Having an interesting conversation." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact. "Just discussing potential business opportunities. Nothing that should concern you." "Everything in my territory concerns me." She began walking toward them, her movements fluid and predatory. "Especially when newcomers start asking questions about established business practices." Thomas stepped slightly behind Marcus, clearly recognizing the signs of impending trouble. Marcus wished he could do the same, but running would only make things worse. Victoria's kind respected strength and despised cowardice, and any sign of weakness would mark him as prey in her eyes. "I'm just trying to help local businesses connect with new markets," Marcus said, keeping his voice level despite the fear coursing through his system. "That's what I was sent here to do." Victoria stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her eyes and smell the subtle scent of ozone that seemed to surround all Beastwomen. At her full height, she towered over his 6-foot frame, and Marcus had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. "What you were sent here to do," she said slowly, "is facilitate trade within the existing framework, not to disrupt established relationships or encourage vendors to circumvent security protocols." "I wasn't aware that helping someone lift a crate constituted disruption." The words were out of his mouth before he could stop them, and Marcus immediately knew he'd made a mistake. Victoria's eyes narrowed, and a low growl rumbled in her throat. Several nearby vendors began closing their stalls despite the early hour, recognizing the signs of an impending confrontation. "Careful, Thompson," Victoria said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You're new here, so I'll give you one chance to walk away and pretend this conversation never happened." Marcus knew he should take the offer. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to apologize, back down, and find another way to accomplish his mission. But something about her dismissive tone and the way Thomas cowered behind him triggered a stubborn streak that had gotten him in trouble his entire life. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I don't think I've done anything that requires an apology. If you have concerns about my activities, you're welcome to file a complaint with the colonial authority." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the constant background noise of the bazaar seemed to fade as everyone within earshot realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Humans simply didn't challenge Beastwomen directly, especially not Victoria Blackthorne. For a moment, Marcus thought she might actually walk away. Her expression remained carefully neutral, and he couldn't read any obvious signs of aggression in her posture. Then she smiled, revealing the prominent canine teeth that marked her as a predator, and Marcus realized he'd made a terrible miscalculation. "You know," she said conversationally, "I was just thinking how nice it would be to have a demonstration of why established protocols exist in the first place." Before Marcus could respond or react, Victoria's hand shot out and grabbed the front of his shirt. Her enhanced strength was immediately apparent as she lifted him off the ground with one arm, holding him at eye level like he weighed nothing at all. Marcus grabbed her wrist instinctively, but it was like trying to bend a steel bar. "Let me explain something to you, Thompson," she said, her voice remaining calm despite the violence of her actions. "This bazaar operates on respect and understanding. When someone doesn't show proper respect, understanding follows quickly." With that, she drew back her arm and threw him. Marcus had always known intellectually that Beastwomen possessed superhuman strength, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. He flew through the air like a rag doll, traveling at least 30 feet before crashing into a display of ceramic pottery. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent waves of pain through his back and shoulders. Shards of broken ceramics rained down around him as he struggled to catch his breath. The pottery vendor, an elderly crystalline named Zara, stared down at him with what he assumed was shock, though it was difficult to read expressions on her translucent features. "Are you injured, human?" she asked in her musical voice. Marcus took inventory of his body parts and was surprised to find that nothing seemed to be broken. His back and shoulders would be sore for days, and he'd probably have some spectacular bruises. But Victoria had apparently calibrated her throw to humiliate rather than seriously injure him. "I think I'm okay," he said, accepting Zara's help to stand up. "I'm sorry about your pottery." "Items can be replaced," she replied, her tone suggesting she was more concerned about his welfare than her merchandise. Pride is more difficult to repair. Marcus looked back toward where Victoria stood, surrounded by her usual entourage of security personnel who had materialized from various parts of the bazaar. She was watching him with an expression of satisfied amusement, clearly pleased with her demonstration of dominance. "A pride," he said quietly, "isn't the only thing that needs repairing." That evening, Marcus sat in his small apartment reviewing the day's events and trying to figure out his next move. His back ached, his pride was in shambles, and his mission to establish better trade relationships had suffered a significant setback. Word of his humiliation had spread throughout the bazaar within hours, and he suspected it would be much harder to gain vendors' trust now that they'd seen how easily Victoria could dispose of him. But alongside the embarrassment and physical discomfort, Marcus felt something else growing: determination. He'd spent his entire life dealing with bullies who used superior strength or position to intimidate others. Victoria Blackthorne might be stronger and faster than any human, but she was still fundamentally the same type of person who had made his childhood miserable and his early career challenging. The difference was that this time, he had resources and knowledge that his younger self had lacked. More importantly, he had something that Victoria apparently didn't expect from humans: the refusal to stay down after being knocked down. Marcus opened his personal communication device and began composing a message to his supervisor at the Colonial Development Initiative. If Victoria wanted to play games involving security protocols and established business practices, he was more than happy to show her how those games were played at the highest levels. After all, she might control the eastern quarter of the Meridian Bazaar, but Marcus represented the interests of the entire human colonial government, and he was about to remind everyone involved exactly what that meant. The response from Colonial Development Initiative came faster than Marcus had expected. Within 18 hours of his detailed report about the incident, he received a priority message from Director Amanda Walsh, his immediate supervisor back on Earth. "Marcus, your report is concerning on multiple levels. We've forwarded your account to the Colonial Authority on Kepler-7 and are requesting a full investigation into Ms. Blackthorne's business practices. In the meantime, continue your work but avoid direct confrontation. We can't afford to lose another trade liaison to jurisdictional disputes." Another trade liaison. Marcus made a mental note to research what had happened to his predecessor. The official records had simply stated that Jennifer Martinez had requested transfer to a different assignment, but now he wondered if there was more to the story. Marcus spent the next few days working carefully around Victoria's territory while gathering information about her business operations. What he discovered was both impressive and deeply troubling. Apex Protection Services had evolved from a simple security company into something resembling a shadow government within New Harmony. They controlled vendor licenses, arbitrated disputes, collected fees for protection services, and maintained their own private security force that operated independently of official colonial authority oversight. Even more concerning was the pattern of businesses that had failed or been forced to relocate after running afoul of Victoria's organization. Thomas Kim's electronics stall was just the latest in a series of independent vendors who had found themselves unable to compete after being excluded from Victoria's approved supplier network. The investigation Marcus had requested was officially launched on Thursday morning. Colonial Authority Inspector David Reeves arrived at the bazaar accompanied by 2 junior investigators and a recording technician. Marcus had worked with Reeves before and found him to be thorough and fair, if somewhat overwhelmed by the complexity of managing a multi-species colony. "Thompson," Reeves said as they met near the bazaar's main entrance, "I've read your report, but I want to hear the story directly from you. Walk me through exactly what happened." Marcus led the investigation team to Thomas Kim's stall, pointing out the relevant locations and describing the sequence of events that had led to his impromptu flight across the marketplace. Thomas himself was nervous about speaking to the investigators, but eventually agreed to provide a statement about Victoria's business practices and their impact on independent vendors. "She's not breaking any specific laws," Thomas explained, glancing around nervously as he spoke. "The colonial authority allows private security companies to establish operational guidelines for their coverage areas, but the way she interprets those guidelines, it's like she's running her own little kingdom." Inspector Reeves took detailed notes and asked several follow-up questions about the fee structure for Victoria's services and the process by which vendors were approved or rejected for her supplier network. What emerged was a picture of systematic control that skirted the edges of legality while effectively monopolizing large sections of the bazaar's economy. "We'll need to interview Ms. Blackthorne directly," Reeves said after completing his initial fact-gathering. "Thompson, I'd prefer if you weren't present for that conversation. Given the history between you two, your presence might complicate matters." Marcus agreed, though he would have preferred to witness Victoria's response to official scrutiny. Instead, he spent the afternoon visiting vendors in sections of the bazaar that fell outside her direct control, continuing his work of establishing trade relationships while trying to build a broader picture of how her organization operated. The interview with Victoria took place in the late afternoon at her company's offices, a converted warehouse that served as headquarters for Apex Protection Services. Marcus waited anxiously for news, checking his communication device every few minutes for updates from Inspector Reeves. When the investigators finally emerged from the building, their expressions were carefully neutral. Reeves approached Marcus with the measured pace of someone delivering unwelcome news. Ms. Blackthorne was cooperative and provided documentation for all her business practices, he said. From a legal standpoint, everything appears to be within the bounds of her operating license. The physical altercation you described was witnessed by multiple people, but she claims it was a misunderstanding that got out of hand. A misunderstanding. Marcus couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice. She threw me 30 feet across the bazaar. According to her account, you became aggressive during your conversation, and she was forced to restrain you. The level of force used was regrettable, but she claims it was necessary to prevent further escalation. Marcus stared at the inspector in shock. You can't seriously believe that version of events. What I believe isn't relevant, Reeves replied firmly. What matters is what can be proven. Ms. Blackthorne has provided witness statements from several of her employees who corroborate her version of events. Without independent verification of your account, this becomes a matter of competing narratives. What about Thomas Kim? He was there, he saw what happened. Mr. Kim's statement was less definitive than your report suggested. He acknowledged that there was a confrontation, but he couldn't clearly identify who initiated the physical contact or whether your behavior might have been interpreted as threatening. Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized what had happened. Victoria's influence in the bazaar was so comprehensive that even witnesses to her misconduct were afraid to speak against her. Thomas's livelihood depended on maintaining good relationships with all the major players in the marketplace, and testifying against Victoria would effectively end his business. So that's it, Marcus asked. She can assault anyone she wants as long as her employees are willing to lie about it. The investigation remains open, Reeves said, though his tone suggested otherwise. If you can provide additional evidence or find witnesses willing to provide sworn statements, we'll certainly review them. But based on the information currently available, there aren't grounds for formal charges. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment wrestling with frustration and a growing sense of helplessness. The official channels he'd relied on throughout his career had proven inadequate against someone who understood how to manipulate the system from within. Victoria's control over the bazaar was so complete that challenging her through normal means was essentially impossible. But Marcus had learned something important during his years in Detroit's business community. When official channels failed, unofficial ones often remained open. The key was understanding how power really flowed within a community and finding ways to work within those hidden structures. He opened his communication device and began researching Victoria's background more thoroughly. If she had weaknesses or vulnerabilities, they would be found in her history rather than her current operations. Every successful bully had blind spots, and Marcus was determined to find hers. What he discovered was fascinating. Before coming to Kepler-7, Victoria had served with distinction in the Terran Defense Forces, specializing in hostile environment operations. Her military record was exemplary, with commendations for bravery and leadership under fire. She'd volunteered for the Beastwoman Enhancement Program during humanity's war with the hegemony, trading her natural form for the ability to fight alongside enhanced soldiers against alien invaders. The war had ended 12 years ago, and many enhanced veterans had struggled to find their place in peacetime society. Some, like Victoria, had chosen to leave Earth entirely and seek opportunities on frontier worlds where their abilities were more valued. Others had found work in private security or law enforcement roles that made use of their enhanced capabilities. But there was something else in Victoria's file that caught Marcus's attention. Before her military service, she'd grown up in the agricultural districts of Titan Colony, where her family had operated a small farming cooperative. The records were sparse, but they indicated that the cooperative had failed during her childhood, forcing her family into bankruptcy and eventually leading to their relocation to Earth. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing this information. Victoria's current behavior suddenly made more sense when viewed through the lens of someone who had experienced powerlessness early in life. Her need to control every aspect of the bazaar's operations, her intolerance for challenges to her authority, even her aggressive response to his attempt to help Thomas Kim. All of it suggested someone who was determined never to be vulnerable again. Understanding Victoria's motivations didn't excuse her behavior, but it did provide Marcus with insight into how she might be approached differently. Direct confrontation had failed spectacularly, and official channels had proven inadequate. But perhaps there was a third option that involved working with her psychological framework rather than against it. Marcus began drafting a new message to Director Walsh, outlining a different approach to the Victoria Blackthorne problem. Instead of trying to remove her from power or circumvent her authority, he proposed a strategy that would channel her protective instincts in directions that served the broader community's interests. It was a risky plan that would require careful execution and considerable patience. But Marcus had learned that the most effective way to deal with bullies wasn't always to fight them directly. Sometimes, the best approach was to find ways to make them your allies instead of your enemies. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Marcus arrived at the bazaar to find Thomas Kim's stall closed and a "For Rent" sign posted in its window. Other vendors in the area seemed nervous and reluctant to make eye contact, suggesting that something significant had happened overnight. Marcus approached Elena Rodriguez, who operated a textile stall near Thomas's former location. Elena had always been friendly and seemed less intimidated by Victoria's presence than many other vendors. "What happened to Thomas?" he asked quietly. Elena glanced around nervously before responding. "He left last night, said he'd received an offer to relocate his business to the Centauri settlement, but everyone knows what really happened." "Which was?" "Victoria's people visited him yesterday evening after the Colonial Authority investigators left. They had a conversation about the importance of accurate testimony and community loyalty. This morning, Thomas decided that Centauri offered better opportunities for his business." Marcus felt a surge of anger at the implications of Elena's words. Victoria had clearly intimidated Thomas into leaving rather than risk having him provide testimony that contradicted her version of events. It was a sophisticated form of witness tampering that would be difficult to prove but highly effective in practice. "Did anyone else witness this conversation?" Marcus asked. "Several people saw Victoria's security team enter Thomas's stall, but nobody heard what was discussed. And now that Thomas is gone, there's no one left to ask." Marcus thanked Elena for the information and walked slowly through the bazaar, processing this latest development. Victoria's response to the official investigation demonstrated both her intelligence and her ruthlessness. She understood that controlling the narrative was more important than winning individual confrontations, and she was willing to use intimidation to maintain that control. But her actions also revealed something else. She was concerned enough about the investigation to take active steps to protect herself. That suggested she recognized that her position, while strong, wasn't invulnerable to challenge. Marcus filed that observation away for future reference. As he continued through the marketplace, Marcus noticed something else that struck him as significant. While Victoria's core supporters remained loyal, there was a subtle shift in the attitudes of neutral vendors. Several people who had previously been merely polite now seemed genuinely sympathetic to his situation. Word of his humiliating flight across the bazaar had indeed spread throughout the community, but instead of marking him as a failure, it seemed to have established him as someone willing to stand up to Victoria despite the personal cost. That afternoon, Marcus received another message from Director Walsh containing both good news and troubling information. The Colonial Development Initiative had approved his alternative approach to dealing with Victoria, but they'd also uncovered additional details about his predecessor's departure from Kepler-7. Jennifer Martinez hadn't simply requested a transfer to another assignment. She'd been hospitalized for 3 days after what official records described as an unfortunate accident involving heavy machinery at the bazaar. Witness statements indicated that she'd been attempting to document safety violations at one of Victoria's warehouses when a loading crane had malfunctioned, nearly crushing her. The crane's malfunction had been attributed to mechanical failure, and no charges had been filed. But the timing of the accident, combined with Jennifer's immediate request for transfer upon her release from the hospital, suggested a pattern of intimidation that went far beyond Marcus's own experience. Reading between the lines of the official report, Marcus realized that Victoria's methods for dealing with problematic colonial authority personnel were more sophisticated and dangerous than he'd initially understood. His public humiliation had been relatively mild compared to what could have happened if she'd chosen to escalate the situation further. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a few days earlier. Instead of planning his next move against Victoria, he began preparing to approach her directly with a proposal for cooperation. It was a strategy born of necessity rather than preference, but it offered the best chance of achieving his mission objectives while avoiding the fate that had befallen his predecessor. The key would be presenting his proposal in terms that appealed to Victoria's self-interest, while demonstrating that he posed no threat to her established authority. It would require careful preparation and flawless execution, but Marcus believed it represented his best chance of turning an adversary into an ally. After all, if you couldn't beat them, sometimes the wisest course was to find a way to join them. Marcus spent 3 days preparing for his approach to Victoria, researching her business operations and developing a proposal that would benefit both her organization and his mission objectives. The key insight came from studying the economic flows within the bazaar and recognizing patterns that Victoria herself might not have fully appreciated. Her protection services generated steady revenue, but they were ultimately a cost center for the vendors who paid for them. A more profitable approach would involve expanding the bazaar's overall economic activity, which would increase both the number of potential clients and their ability to pay for premium services. Marcus's connections to human colonial settlements represented exactly the kind of expansion opportunity that could benefit everyone involved. The proposal he developed was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to circumvent Victoria's authority, he would work through her organization to establish new trade routes and vendor relationships. Apex Protection Services would handle security and logistics for the expanded operations, while Marcus would provide the contacts and regulatory expertise needed to navigate human colonial bureaucracy. The arrangement would give Victoria control over the new business relationships, while allowing Marcus to accomplish his mission objectives. More importantly, It would demonstrate to other vendors that cooperation with his initiatives was not only acceptable but actively encouraged by the bazaar's most powerful figure. Marcus requested a formal meeting through Victoria's business offices, making it clear that he wanted to discuss potential collaboration rather than relitigate past conflicts. The response came back within hours. Victoria would see him at her office the following afternoon. Apex Protection Services headquarters occupied a converted warehouse in the industrial district adjacent to the bazaar. The building's exterior was unremarkable, but the interior had been extensively modified to serve as both office space and operational center. Security monitors displayed feeds from cameras throughout Victoria's territory, while sophisticated communication equipment maintained contact with roving patrol units. Victoria's personal office occupied the building's top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a commanding view of the entire bazaar district. She was standing with her back to the door when Marcus was escorted in, apparently studying something in the distance that held her attention. "Thompson," she said without turning around, "I understand you have a business proposal." "That's correct," Marcus replied, remaining standing near the door until invited to sit. "I believe we may have been approaching our relationship from the wrong angle." Victoria turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. She was wearing a professional business suit that somehow managed to emphasize rather than conceal her enhanced physique. Her amber eyes studied him with the same intensity he remembered from their previous encounters, but without the obvious hostility. "Explain," she said simply. Marcus moved to the chair across from her desk and waited for her gesture of permission before sitting down. Everything about the interaction was being carefully choreographed to demonstrate respect for her authority and position. "The Colonial Development Initiative sent me here to expand trade relationships between human settlements and local vendors," he began. "Your organization controls security and logistics for a significant portion of the bazaar. Instead of working around each other, we should be working together." Victoria settled into her own chair, her posture relaxed but alert. "Continue." Marcus opened his briefcase and withdrew a data pad containing his detailed proposal. "I have contacts with 17 human settlements that are currently underserved by existing trade networks. They need everything from basic manufactured goods to specialized equipment, and they're willing to pay premium prices for reliable service." He slid the data pad across the desk, noting how Victoria's enhanced reflexes allowed her to catch it smoothly despite his deliberately casual toss. "The problem is that most local vendors don't have the resources or expertise to navigate human colonial regulations. They need an organization with experience in security, logistics, and bureaucratic procedures." Victoria scrolled through the proposal, her expression revealing nothing about her thoughts. Marcus waited patiently, knowing that rushing her evaluation would be counterproductive. "Interesting," she said finally. "But why come to me with this now? A week ago you were challenging my authority in public." Marcus had prepared for this question, recognizing that his previous behavior would need to be addressed directly. "A week ago, I was operating under the assumption that established power structures were obstacles to overcome rather than resources to utilize. I've since learned that success on Kepler-7 requires understanding and working within existing frameworks." "And what exactly do you think you've learned about existing frameworks?" The question carried multiple layers of meaning, and Marcus recognized it as a test of his understanding of local political realities. His answer would determine whether Victoria saw him as a potential ally or simply another colonial administrator who had learned to pay lip service to her authority. "I've learned that effective leadership requires both strength and wisdom," he said carefully. "The vendors in your territory respect you because you provide genuine value in the form of security and stability. The colonial authority works with you because you understand local conditions better than any outside administrator could." Victoria's expression softened slightly, suggesting that his answer had been acceptable. "But you still think there's room for improvement." "I think there's room for growth," Marcus corrected. "Your current operations are highly successful within their established parameters, but there are opportunities for expansion that could benefit everyone involved, including yourself." "Including myself," Marcus acknowledged. "I'm not pretending this proposal is purely altruistic. I have mission objectives to accomplish, and working with your organization represents the most efficient path to achieving them." Victoria leaned back in her chair, studying him with renewed interest. "At least you're honest about your motivations. That's more than I can say for most colonial authority personnel." She stood and walked to the windows, looking out over the bazaar where late afternoon shadows were beginning to stretch across the marketplace. "Tell me about these 17 settlements. What makes you think they represent genuine opportunities rather than bureaucratic wishful thinking?" Marcus joined her at the windows, noting how the elevated perspective revealed patterns of activity that weren't apparent from ground level. Victoria's choice of office location was clearly strategic, providing both symbolic and practical advantages. "3 of them are mining colonies that need specialized equipment and supplies," he said. 4 are agricultural settlements that produce surplus crops but lack access to manufacturing centers. The remainder are mixed communities that serve as waypoints for deep space trading vessels. And they're all currently underserved by existing trade networks." Most of them rely on irregular supply runs from Earth or the major colonial centers. They pay premium prices for basic goods and often go without specialized items entirely. A reliable local supplier network would be incredibly valuable to them. Victoria nodded slowly, apparently processing the economic implications of his proposal. The logistics would be complex. My people are good, but we don't have experience with interplanetary commerce. That's where the Colonial Development Initiative comes in, Marcus said. I can provide regulatory guidance, customs documentation, and shipping coordination. Your organization would handle local operations, security, and vendor management. And the revenue split. Marcus had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that would appeal to Victoria's business instincts. 60-40, with your organization taking the larger share. You'll be providing the infrastructure and assuming most of the operational risk. Victoria turned to face him, one eyebrow raised in apparent surprise. That's more generous than I expected. Success requires all parties to benefit proportionally to their contributions, Marcus replied. If this partnership works well, there will be opportunities for further expansion. I'm more interested in building sustainable relationships than maximizing short-term profits. They spent the next hour reviewing the details of Marcus's proposal, with Victoria asking pointed questions about potential challenges and complications. Her business acumen was impressive, and she quickly identified several issues that Marcus hadn't fully considered. More importantly, her questions demonstrated genuine interest in making the partnership work rather than simply finding reasons to reject it. I'll need to discuss this with my senior staff, Victoria said finally. And we'll want to start with a limited pilot program rather than committing to all 17 settlements immediately. That makes perfect sense, Marcus agreed. I'd suggest beginning with the 3 mining colonies. They have the most urgent needs and the most predictable demand patterns. Victoria nodded, then fixed him with a direct stare that reminded him of their previous encounters. Thompson, I want to be absolutely clear about something. If we move forward with this partnership, it will be on the basis of mutual respect and professional cooperation. But if you ever embarrass me publicly again, business relationship or not, the consequences will be much more severe than what happened last week. Marcus met her gaze steadily, recognizing both the warning and the implicit acceptance it contained. Understood. And I want to be equally clear that my commitment to this partnership extends beyond simple business considerations. If we're going to work together, you have my loyalty as well as my professional services. Victoria extended her hand, and this time Marcus didn't hesitate to shake it. Her grip was firm but not crushing, and her smile revealed only normal human teeth rather than the prominent canines she displayed during their confrontation. "Welcome to Apex Protection Services, partner," she said. As Marcus left Victoria's office that afternoon, he reflected on the unexpected turn his assignment had taken. 3 days ago, he'd viewed her as an obstacle to overcome. Now, she was potentially his most valuable ally on Kepler-7. The transformation hadn't required him to compromise his principles or abandon his mission objectives. Instead, it had simply required him to approach the situation from a different angle. Sometimes, the best way to deal with a powerful adversary wasn't to fight them or circumvent them. Sometimes, the best approach was to find ways to make their success dependent on your own. The pilot program launched 2 weeks later with Victoria's characteristic efficiency and attention to detail. She assigned her most experienced logistics coordinator, Patricia Hayes, to work directly with Marcus on establishing supply chains for the 3 mining colonies they'd selected as test cases.